Jayne is ITSM Academy's co-founder and president. She holds numerous certifications, including Agile Expert and Service Manager, as well as ISO 20000 Consultant and Certified Scrum Master. Jayne is active in the ITSM and DevOps communities and is a frequent webinar and conference presenter. Prior to co-founding ITSM Academy, Jayne worked for more than 20 years as an IT practitioner and, in IT senior management. Her experience spans a wide range of industries, including legal, telecommunications, retail, nonprofit, insurance, and hospitality. Jayne ensures that all ITSM Academy trainers bring similar practical experiences into each classroom and that all of our courseware and content incorporates the same depth of knowledge. Good morning, Jayne.
Good morning, Karen. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you're located. I'm really excited today to be talking about Agile Service Management and being able to share some of my insights about what we need to do to take service management to the next step. So let's get started and look at what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to ask and answer some basic questions about Agile. And I know that the concept of Agile has been floating around IT now for quite a bit, and in the service management space, we're certainly starting to hear a lot more about Agile. So it's no longer for software development any longer. So we're going to look at what Agile is and what it isn't. We're going to talk about some Agile practices like Scrum, and then we're going to focus on what is Agile service management. So how do we make our service management practices more Agile? A couple of basic tips for getting started, and of course some guidance if you're interested in learning more about Agile or Agile service management. So let's get started. Some of you may have seen a slide like this, or even a slide from years of our courses, but this is not a new challenge for us, right? IT has been challenged historically with having to increase the quality of our IT services while controlling our costs and risks. We've always been asked to do more with less. And over the last 10 years, particularly with the introduction of ITIL and IT service management programs, business IT integration has become a core requirement for IT. So you might hear often about running IT like a business IT alignment. What's happening now, and I think this is where the paradigm shift is going to occur within the next several years, certainly if it isn't happening in your environment today, is we're being asked to go faster. And your definition of faster may not necessarily be 100 deployments a day. It may be reducing your deployments from once a year to twice a year, or once a quarter, or once a month, or once a week. However that is required in your environment, IT is certainly being required to go faster. We're being required to be more innovative. We're being required to be more lean, less waste. So part of this go faster message is coming partly from development, partly from operations, but certainly all the time through the business. And as we've always said, in order to achieve all of these requirements, IT organizations have to adopt a service-oriented approach so that we can be effective, we can be efficient, and certainly we can meet business needs. So if you look at the technology outlook, and I'm sure I'm not sharing big news here with anyone, but here's what's happening today and here's what's coming tomorrow. Mobile technology, right? Everything is mobile. Tablets, iPhones, smartphones, wearable technology. I was at a conference recently, and it was really remarkable how many people were walking around with Google Glass. A little scary. Cloud, cloud, cloud. I mean, we're talking about the cloud. We're moving to the cloud. I heard somebody say recently that if your organization is not cloud services today, it will be within the next 5 years. Same thing with virtualization, right? The day of having, massive data centers, massive number of servers instead of standing up virtual servers. Certainly there's a very big movement in that direction. And you're all familiar with social, right? We're tweeting during this presentation. Social media has come inside the organization, so it's no longer just Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. Organizations are starting internal social media programs so that they can communicate with each other regardless of geographical boundaries. We're becoming one world, and organizations are reaching out beyond their geographical boundaries without limitation, and that may include internal employees. It certainly may include outsourcers. Lots of discussions about BYOD, and I think BYOD is here. I don't think that's the future. I think the next generation that's entering the marketplace is going to require the ability to choose their own device and not the device that we provision for them. And then, of course, you know, the burning question is what's next? What's coming next? And how do these individual technologies contribute to services to the customer? Because in truth, customers will always rely on services. So regardless of what software is deployed, regardless of what technology is in use, one or more of those technologies, whether it's applications, infrastructure, device, will somehow result in a service that delivers an outcome that a customer wants to achieve. So customers will always rely on services, and services will always need to be managed. And so if we look at these two definitions from ITIL, these definitions will survive whether we stay with ITIL, whether we continue on service management programs, which we will have to do, regardless of what framework you're using, regardless of what technology is in use in your organizations. Customers will always rely on services, and those services will always need to be managed, and service management will always be a set of specialized organizational capabilities. The question then has to become, how are we going to manage these services in the future? Rapidly changing service requirements are going to require rapidly changing IT capabilities. So some of the capabilities that we have today will survive in the long run. Some of those capabilities will need to be streamlined. Some of those capabilities will need to be adapted from other methods or frameworks such as Agile. But we're going to need to go faster, and in order to go faster, we're going to have to look at those capabilities and make them more modern. So as a result of that, IT must learn to be more agile. Now, software developers figured this out several years ago when they recognized that some of their internal processes, some of what it took for software to make it to the market was actually hindering their ability to go forward. But if we look at the classic definition of agile from a dictionary perspective, it's the ability to move quickly, to be able to move quickly and easily, to be able to think quickly, to be able to solve problems, and the ability to have new ideas. So that's not Scrum, that's not necessarily Kanban, that's not necessarily ITIL or ITSM. The classic definition of being agile is the ability to move quickly and easily, think quickly, solve problems, and have new ideas. So let's talk about Agile from an IT perspective. I have to start this with what Agile is not, because in the market, in the webinars, in presentations, in white papers, in your own organization perhaps, we sometimes mistake Agile with Scrum. And while Scrum is the most prominent framework in use today, and it's an awesome framework, it is not necessarily the same as Agile. Agile is not one framework, it's not a standard, it's not a methodology. As I said, it's not the same as Scrum. It is not limited to software development projects, and a lot of what you may still read about Agile still puts it in the context of application development, but we're certainly seeing Scrum concepts and the approach of being Agile extending way beyond software development. It's not governed by a single certification, qualification, or institute, and so there are many opportunities to become Agile, to learn more about Agile, because Agile is a set of guiding values and principles. It's applicable way beyond software development, and there's lots of case studies that's starting to prove that, but those frameworks bring it to life. So frameworks such as Scrum, frameworks such as Kanban, and if you're not familiar with Kanban, I'll give you a little introduction to it in a few minutes. It's not, I heard something recently called Scrum, where you take Scrum and Kanban together and put them together, and there's a framework that's starting to emerge called Scrumban. But it's more about perspective than prescription. So being Agile, the ability to be Agile, is really from your perspective, and you bring that perspective to life through various frameworks and methodologies, including ITIL and ITSM. So if you're interested in learning more about Agile, the Agile Manifesto is available to you online. Here it is. It was developed several years ago, I believe it was in 2001, by a group of very frustrated developers who got together at a ski resort and they came together to talk about the state of their community. And what they finally agreed upon is that their community was perhaps being forced to, or on their own, were focusing on the wrong things. So they came up with a manifesto that talked about Agile values. And if you look at the manifesto, it's not discounting one side or the other. So it's not saying that we're not going to have process and tools, we're not going to have comprehensive documentation or contract negotiations or following a plan. It's that we value the items on the left more. So we value individuals and interactions over extensive process and tools. And we value working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiations, and responding to change over following a plan. And the group that got together in 2001 were very clear in articulating that they do value the items on the right, just value the items on the left more. Now, perhaps if this is the first time you've seen it, or when you saw it for the first time, you might have looked at it and said, whoa, this is a little contrary to everything that we've promoted, everything that we've taught, everything that we've introduced to our organization as new behaviors. So are these contrary to our values in ITSM? Well, I have to ask the question, do we really value process and tools over individuals and interactions? Do we really value, excuse me, comprehensive documentation over working software and services? Do we really value our SLAs, our OLAs, our contracts more than collaborating with our customers? And do we really value following a plan, a set of procedures, as opposed to being able to respond to change? And the answer, I'm hoping that you're all shaking your head going, no, we don't value that more than the items on the left. But it is something that we need to look at within our service management programs and understand whether we have inadvertently placed more emphasis on the items on the right than some of the items on the left. So the Agile Manifesto was backed up by 12 principles, and I've taken the liberty of truncating those principles into their core concepts. And again, if you're interested in reading the pure Agile Manifesto and its principles, I'll give you the link at the end. But look at these principles, and I'll give you just a second or two to look at them. They're not that different from our ITSM principles, right? We've talked about satisfying the customer. We've talked about working with the business. We've talked about improving our communications and being able to measure our results. Right. We've talked about sustainability and repeatability and promoting consistency. We've talked a lot about reflecting and tuning. So many of these core Agile principles are also core ITSM principles. Now, some are not, right? And some, I think, would enhance our service management program, such as number 11, let's create some self-organizing teams. And that's certainly a core concept that comes out of the Agile Manifesto and is embraced in Scrum. And number 10, let's celebrate the work we didn't have to do because we were able to be more agile, to be more lean, to be much more efficient. So again, Agile and Scrum and Agile and service management principles, not that far apart. So as I've said before, while Agile is certainly not synonymous with Scrum, Scrum is the most prominent of the frameworks, and I would be remiss today if I didn't at least address that from a very, very high level. So let's look at some of the Agile practices. So the manifesto gave rise to frameworks. Scrum is the most prominent and most recognized and most applied. I know in our polling questions today, the question of are you familiar with Agile and Scrum, and are your developers using Agile practices? And we are rapidly seeing Agile practices in the form of Scrum replacing Waterfall as the preferred software development lifecycle approach in many, many development environments. It just allows us to move faster and to get things done. But there are other Agile frameworks. Kanban, if you look at the graphic on the bottom, Kanban is a visualization methodology where you actually visualize the flow of work. Very, very simple. I'll give you a link at the end for a free tool where you can certainly practice for yourself and a small team in being able to leverage the power of a Kanban. But essentially the Kanban has 4 columns. First column is a backlog of work, right? So you document all of the backlog of work, put it in some type of priority order. Then your next column is to do, and so you're taking a chunk of that backlog and bringing it into the work we're going to do during a certain period of time. In Scrum, it would be called a sprint. We'll get there on the next slide. But it's the amount of work you're going to do in this period of time. I use it personally. I bring in my to-dos for this week. And when I actually start to work on each of those tasks, you move the sticky, or in some electronic cases, you drag a card over into the in progress column so that you know that you're actively working on that task. And when it's done, you move it into done. And if you've done a good job and if you've been able to measure the amount of work you can get done in that period of time, by the end of that what we call a time box, at the end of that time box, everything that was in the to-do would now be in the done. So again, very, very simple approach, but very visual. And software developers have been using it, big whiteboards with sticky notes in their development environment. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Extreme programming, the ability to go much more quickly. Organizations are looking at concepts like continuous delivery, which is not frequent deployment. It's not the same as frequent deployment. Continuous delivery means that your software is always in a state where it could be released. So no matter what you're working on, if you had to today do a release of that software, it would be the ability to continuously deliver it would be there. And as I mentioned before, there are new practices that are emerging on a fairly frequent basis, including this concept of Scrum, where you take Scrum principles and this visual Kanban board and put it together. So Scrum, again, most of the time when organizations talk about being agile or using agile or applying agile, they really are talking about Scrum. So this definition from scrum.org, I think, is a really good definition of what Scrum is. It's a simple framework. It encourages effective team collaboration on complex projects. It provides a small set of rules that create just enough structure for teams to be able to focus their innovation on solving what might otherwise be an insurmountable challenge. And you'll notice I underline the term just enough, because that's what Scrum is all about. It's about giving just enough structure. That's what the Agile Manifesto was all about, having just enough process, just enough documentation, just enough contracts, and just enough plans and planning to be able to take very, very complex projects and break them down into meaningful bites. Deceptively simple, yet difficult to master, because we are not comfortable yet with just enough. We're not comfortable yet with self-organizing teams, right? We're not comfortable enough yet with doing work in increments, but we're getting better at it. And so as organizations are starting to bring Agile and Scrum into their environment, they're learning. And as they're learning, they're improving. And as they're improving, their ability to go much more quickly and really be able to master Scrum from a human perspective, right? There's a very big human element here, is certainly starting to grow forward. It is important to note, however, that Scrum is not a process or technique for building products. It's for managing projects. It's how you take a project, whether it is a software development project or perhaps a process design project, where you're looking at reinventing or introducing, re-engineering, or improving a process. There's no reason that you could not apply these same concepts to your process design, because the whole goal is to be able to move the project or program forward. So it's not about building products. And I think, truthfully, that's been part of the challenge over time, is because it's so clearly associated with software development products, that there is a belief that that is the primary goal here. So if I had to sum up Scrum in one sentence, it would be that Scrum gets things done. The whole goal of Scrum is to be able to move a project forward in increments, and each increment has its own definition of done. It's a very, very core concept within Scrum, that we understand what that definition of done actually means. So there's good planning and review. There are very well-defined meetings that occur at different aspects throughout the Scrum lifecycle. There are agreed user stories where we take the story of how the user is going to use a feature or a function or an aspect of a process, and we articulate it. We write it down, and we agree with the user and the customer that this is how they will actually gain value, but actually use it, right? So it gets down a little bit deeper than how do I get value. It's, okay, let me make sure I understand how you're going to actually do this to make sure that I replicate that in as close a way as possible. So in software, it might be a feature. In process, it might be an activity or a procedure to make sure you understand how the user is going to execute that part of the process, that activity, or even down to a procedure, and make sure there's clarification so that theory becomes reality in a truthful way. Small self-organizing teams. Scrum very clearly says more than 3 and less than 9. So it is not advocating that your teams are very big, because in order to be self-organizing, we also need to make sure that the team can work together well, there's a chemistry that's built, and they actually can get things done. Everything in Scrum is done in short incremental sprints. So each sprint is usually 2 to 4 weeks. It pulls this chunk of work out of a backlog, and that chunk of work must result in one or more things, however you define things, getting done. So however it's going to get done in that 2 to 4 weeks, at the end of the 2 to 4 weeks, there is something that is completed. Scrum says it is potentially shippable, right? Technically, you could release it. So it has to be able to get things done. As a result of that, one of the benefits of frameworks like Scrum is there's a lot less work in progress. Work in progress is bad. Right? Work in progress is bad. You touch a lot of things, but you don't necessarily get things done. And so you have a lot of balls in the air, but you're not actually achieving results. And I had a boss many years ago on a project that I worked on, and truthfully, I wasn't able to take it to the end. And he said, you're confusing effort with results. So Scrum takes that away. Scrum limits the work in progress because throughout each sprint, the goal is to get things done. So in order to be able to achieve that, there are better workflows, improved responsiveness. Once work is put into a sprint, it's sealed. So there's virtually no scope creep during that period of time in a sprint. Here's what we're going to do. We planned it. We agreed on it. Let's go ahead as a self-organizing team and get it done, but we're not allowed to add things to it afterwards. We can add it to the next sprint, but we're not allowed to add things to it next time. Accomplishments are very, very measurable. Feedback loops are short because the team is self-organizing and it's small, and there's a Scrum Master that's going to help facilitate their work and remove impediments. So the ability after 2 or 4 weeks to have a feedback loop that says, how do we do? What should we do differently the next time? What do we get done? And maybe what do we not get done and why? And be able to take that forward as well. And so as a result of that, impediments to being able to get things done are removed. One at a time, little by little, but they're certainly removed. So if you look in the red text, this is all about, in order to get things done, you have to have a very clear definition of what done looks like for this particular sprint. But it is something that has to be agreed on so that the team understands what their success will look like. Now, another key concept in the Agile world is this concept of velocity. So velocity is the ability of an individual or team to absorb work, right? So my velocity, I may overestimate my velocity today. I may assume that all of the things I have on my to-do list for this week or this day, and I don't accomplish them. So at the end of the day, I have a lot more work in progress. So it is a metric, and we can use it to determine how much work a team can reasonably complete during a sprint, how much work an individual can reasonably take on and still get things done. And the goal is to be able to remove impediments so the velocity increases and more does get done. So being able to understand and measure your personal velocity, the velocity of maybe one of your subordinates or one of your peers, and certainly the velocity of your team is important to becoming agile. So having said all of that and hopefully introduced you at a very, 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 very high level to Agile and Scrum, we have to take it one step forward and look at what is Agile Service Management. So in truth, our cadence is off, right? Our rhythmic flow between the business, between development and operations is off. It's gotten better, right? It's definitely gotten better, but it's off. And part of the reason that it's off is the business has always wanted to go fast. And Dev has been focusing on becoming more agile. So they've been approaching their software development projects using Scrum as their methodology so that they can get things done, and each sprint takes that project, that software development, one increment further. Ops has been focusing on ITSM, and that's great. ITSM is not an obstacle to being agile. It's not as if you throw away everything you've done in ITSM in order to become agile. The business needs both. But certainly the service management processes could stand to be a little bit more agile so that the flow of work between dev and ops, and maybe some of you have heard about the DevOps movement, this is a core concept here. The flow of work between development and operations needs to flow much more smoothly, that we need to look at what those constraints or impediments are, and we need to be able to remove them. So by having agile practices on both sides of the DevOps wall and being able to complement service management with agile practices, making those processes more agile would certainly help the cadence between the business development operations. It's time to cross-pollinate. Right. Certainly it's time to be able to bring some of the service management processes deeper into development, whether it's your suppliers, your outsourcers, or internal developers. So processes like agile change management, I think, would have an enormous amount of value when working with developers, or agile problem management, in order to be able to help the developers identify the root cause of some of their defects, either pre-production or immediately after production, so that those known errors can be declared and we can start looking at some of those workarounds, or the best case scenario, we start to remove those errors from the infrastructure entirely. So we can look at taking some of our processes and making them more agile so that the integration with development is better, but I think more importantly, the processes are much more efficient. Right? So we're not looking at discarding service management. Agile is not a replacement for service management. It is really a complement that helps us look at what we've already built and do it better, do it faster, do it more efficiently. So what does it take to be agile? So before we start looking at how we apply Scrum to service management, we really have to look at, are your processes agile? And so let's go back to that Agile Manifesto. Are your processes customer-centric? Are they lean? Have you been able to look at and identify areas where there's waste, either because there's redundancy or because there's a lack of productivity? Are you collaborative? Are you communicative? And Donna Knapp, our curriculum development manager, always says, you think you've communicated enough? Double your efforts. Right? Are you adaptive? Are your processes meant to adapt to changing times, to changing circumstances? Remember, one of the Agile principles is welcome change. And so we need to make sure our processes are capable of doing that as well. Are your processes measurable? And as you all know, in the ITIL books, there's critical success factors, there's KPIs, there's lots of metrics that are discussed. How many of those metrics are you using, and what are those metrics telling you? So if you go into the ITIL books and think about the 7-step improvement process, that really helps us understand the life cycle of being able to identify data and take it all the way through to action is certainly there. You have to be consistent. And again, in the service management world, we've always said doing a process once is easy. Doing it 1,000 times consistently is hard. And that's part of our challenge when we're writing process, when we're designing process that's meant to be executed, right? It's meant to come to life in the real world. Are you results-oriented? Think about the definition of a service from ITIL, where we're facilitating outcomes that customers want to achieve. So do we understand what those outcomes are? Are we achieving them, and are we achieving them in the most effective and efficient way possible? And are you reflective? Are you taking the time to kind of look back, identify what you've done successfully, how you can improve it going forward, and how you can streamline to be much more effective and efficient? Now, the red text at the bottom, I think, is kind of a nod to how we can apply Scrum. And again, in order to apply Scrum to service management, there is a whole approach, and I'll talk at the end about some education we're offering in that direction. But being agile on the service management side also means that we start to look at self-organizing teams, maybe for your process design programs. We look at self-organizing teams for other IT projects, post-production in particular, but even pre-production. And we understand what it means to burn down a backlog of work. So in order to burn down, right, think about that term, burn down. So we start to chip away at that backlog of work. There has to first be a backlog of work. So there has to be something that's developed, that's articulated, that says, here are the independent things that need to be done, either for this process design, either for this project that we're working on in IT, and we can group those into increments that get something done. And we burn down that backlog in very small iterative sprints, right? The goal is of Agile and Scrum is to be able to progress forward in these small little iterative sprints, because each one is going to get something done, and you can keep moving forward, building on what was done before, as opposed to having just a lot of things floating around that are work in progress. So the first step is to really create this backlog of work, whether, again, it's your process design work, whether it's other things that you're looking to improve, a process improvement project, you're looking to improve your service desk, you're looking at your existing incident management process, you're looking at the ability to introduce meaningful SLAs or OLAs into your organization. You're looking at your patterns of business activity. There's so many different ways that you can take Scrum and apply it to your service management programs, but at the heart of it, you have to understand what it means to be agile. What you don't want to do is start doing this and make your life much more complicated. So, having said that, let's talk about some steps for getting started. Like the developers in 2001 that developed the Agile the Agile Manifesto, they understood there was a need within their community to refocus. So the first question I ask you, and this is going to be individual for each of your organizations and each of your teams, does your program need to refocus? Right? It's a great self-assessment opportunity to really understand, have you become so mired in the items on the right, that how your achievements are measured is how many SLAs you have signed as opposed to what the meaning of those SLAs are. So the first question has to be, are you delivering value to your customers? Right? That's the core definition of service. We have to deliver value to our customers by facilitating their outcomes. Are you delivering value to your customers, and how do you know? Right? How do you know whether they're achieving value from your services or not? And of course, the easy answer to that is ask them. Are you focusing on business outcomes? And do you know what those business outcomes are? So in order for them to achieve that value, we're going to facilitate outcomes, but are we sure that we understand what the user stories are for those outcomes, right? What the business ability of those stories are in order to make sure that we understand what the true outcome actually is. You know, the third bullet, and again, each organization different. I know organizations that have done an amazing job of making their processes much more agile, and a large majority of us have really focused on sort of the operational aspects of service management. So we do prize our tools, right? We celebrate the achievement of deploying a tool, which that's a great achievement, but have we invested more effort in that than perhaps on collaborating with our customers? Are we prizing our flowcharts, our documentations, our plans, and our reports, which are theory, over what we expect to happen in reality, which again, I would call those process user stories. So do we understand the user stories associated with how users are actually going to execute process? So have we designed really beautiful flowcharts, but it's not really getting the job done, and we're not really sure why? Are your changes being deployed on time? How much of your work is really in progress? And I think that's a great self-assessment, to look at what you're doing and say, okay, how much of this is in progress, and how do we convert that to getting things done, and can we do that in small increments? And then the last two, do you know how you're perceived by developers and suppliers from the service management side? And I know sometimes there's a disconnect. And then, do you know how you're being perceived by your customers and users? And that goes a little bit beyond customer satisfaction surveys. I mean, because customer satisfaction surveys are great, But, perception sometimes doesn't translate down into the answer to a question. So a lot of that is collaboration, right? It's having those discussions, having your business analysts or your business relationship managers really help to understand what that perception is. So I guess the burning question is, are we instilling and rewarding the right behaviors, right? Is it more important to get the SLA signed, or is it more important to understand what the customer's requirements actually are? And I'm a big advocate of don't think about your SLAs, think about your SLRs. Think about your requirements, even if you don't get a signed SLA, before you move forward. So some first steps, spend some time with your customers, however that occurs, whether it occurs face-to-face, whether it occurs virtually. Really start to understand your customer's definition of value. And as I said before, write some user stories for your processes. How are your users? Now, some of your users may be IT people that are going to execute your change management process. So write the user story about submitting a request for change. Right? What's actually associated with it? What meaning does it have to the business? What meaning does it have to IT? And how is the change initiator going to do that? Write user stories for your services in terms of understanding what those outcomes are. And then also spend some time with your developers and your suppliers, particularly those that are successfully using Agile and Scrum in their development project. So join a team, right? Join a team. Watch what they do. Every day they have a daily stand-up. Observe the daily stand-up and understand what they're trying to achieve, how they're working their sprints, how they're taking those increments forward. And then analyze your processes and your process assets. Is there waste? Right? And again, there's some lean IT initiatives that are coming forward in the next several months that will help IT understand what waste looks at. Look at your work in progress. Think about whether you're over-processing or where the bottlenecks exist and how you can improve those bottlenecks so the flow of work is better. And as I said before, create a process backlog. For every process that you're trying to design, re-engineer, improve, just create a backlog of work that needs to be done, activity by activity, feature by feature, and then start to chip away at that in increments. Modify your common vocabulary and inject some Agile terminology in there. And so we've strongly encouraged from the ITSM side to have a common vocabulary, and that still exists. But why don't you add some Agile terminology like velocity into your vocabulary? Start talking about your velocity. Doesn't change any of your ITSM vocabulary, but it creates a little bit of a different culture. Look at your small organizing teams and make sure that you understand what the definition of done is for each increment of work, whether done is a procedure in a particular process, whether done is something that's being released to the users and is going to facilitate an outcome. And then start to first just look at your velocity. There are techniques for analyzing it, but first and foremost, look at your own velocity. How much work do you get done in a particular week that you intended to do? Look at your team's velocity in terms of, are you overcommitting, undercommitting, and how can you improve that? So again, I've kind of stood out a little bit on a limb and proposed an Agile Service Management Manifesto, which by no means is something definitive, but I would welcome comments on this in terms of how do we make an Agile Service Management Manifesto meaningful, right? How do we make it something that refocuses our community into what really matters? So I propose that we value business value over process and tools, delivering business value, and quality services over documentations and flowcharts, right? Customer collaborations over SLAs, and embracing change over protecting stability. Now again, like the Agile Manifesto, I'm not suggesting that we ignore those items on the right or that they're not important. I'm suggesting, like the definition of Scrum, we do just enough of that, right? We scale it back to provide just enough process, tools, documentation, flowcharts, SLA, and stability to make the items on the left amazing. So there is some new courseware that's going to be coming out that will help bring this to life. If you're interested in learning more about DevOps, and DevOps, of course, is the integration and improvement of flow work between development and operations. The overview class exists today, and we are actively delivering it. And a fundamentals class, which is a little bit more foundational and practitioner kind of combined together, is coming out in September. we are delivering Certified Scrum Master. I'm a Certified Scrum Master, as are several members of our team. And we found that to be incredibly helpful in terms of our using Agile in order to manage our courses. There will be a 2-day course coming up on Agile Service Management, and it will look at how do you make your processes more agile, how do you apply process design, Agile and Scrum techniques to process design projects. So really, really excited about that. And then coming next year, there'll be some Lean IT courses coming up as well. So the ability to eliminate waste and be more effective and efficient that way. So whole new line of training is coming in. Hopefully that allows you to take your service management programs to the next level. So with that, I'd like to give you some additional sources of information. These are by no means meant to be complete. I mentioned the Agile Manifesto. Scrum Alliance has a great Scrum guide, and we're a Scrum Alliance registered education provider, so you can certainly sign up for our Certified Scrum Master class through those links. If you want to test out a Kanban for free, leankit.com has a free electronic Kanban board that you can play with. I use it personally. I think you can have up to 5 team members there. Our blog, ITSMprofessor.net, often speaks about Agile and service management, and I recently converted my Jayne Explains blog, which you can reach from our website, to be all about Agile DevOps and Leans, and Agile Service Management, of course. So I would encourage you to follow me on Jayne Explains. So on that, Karen, I'm going to open it up for questions.
Thank you, Jayne. And that was great. That was really very informative. So thank you for that presentation today. And I just wanted to remind everybody that if you are interested in having us deliver this webinar for you and your team, please just email us at info@itsmacademy.com, and we'd be happy to do that for you. Now, and I'm just a reminder, if you have questions, please chat them in now. I can see some of them are starting to come in, so please put your questions in now for Jayne. And right before we start the Q&A, Lisa Schwartz, our COO, is here to share some information with us. Hello, Lisa.
Hi, Lisa.
Lisa?
There we go. Can you hear me now?
Yep. We can hear you.
Okay, good. I just wanted to mention, as Jayne said earlier, we do have several class offerings now around DevOps and Agile. The next DevOps overview is scheduled for September 15th. It is a 4-hour virtual class, and we are going to be offering 5 free seats in that class to the first 5 people who today email info@itsmacademy.com. And as those emails come in, it's the first 5 in are the winners, and we'll get you scheduled and set up for the September 15th DevOps overview class.
19th. I'm sorry.
That's okay. It's my fault for not looking at the calendar before I started talking.
That's okay.
I was even though I was completely listening, when my name came up, I forgot I was doing this part. So sorry, guys. I'll be honest. It is Friday, September 19th. You are correct. Thank you, Jayne. And again, that's info@itsmacademy.com. And also, if you'd like information about our Agile, Scrum, or DevOps fundamental course, you can use that same email address to ask us to receive some information about those courses. We're very excited to be expanding our lines of training to include this. So back to you, Karen.
Thank you, Lisa. Right, so get those emails in if you want that free seat. And just before we start the Q&A, for those of you that need to drop off, I'd just like to remind you that our next webinar is scheduled for Thursday, August 21st, when Jeff Brooks, and he's the Research Vice President at Gartner, he's going to join us with his presentation titled, Tell the Story with Business Value Dashboards. And that's demonstrating business value remains a challenge for most I&O leaders, and business value dashboard success requires an alternative approach to common performance and productivity metrics reporting. So BVDs hold promise for I&O teams to clearly demonstrate their positive impact on business priorities. So we hope you'll join us for that as well. Okay, you ready?
Karen?
Yes?
Sorry, it's Lisa again. I just want to say that I like to joke with Jeff about the fact that he works for Gartner. I mean, only respect to everyone at Gartner, but Jeff is very down to earth, and his presentation is going to have lots of very tangible, actionable items. So it's not sort of a high-level theory research presentation, which Gartner does beautifully. This is much more of a grassroots presentation, and so I just kind of wanted to say that because folks on the call who have seen some of the really highbrow Gartner stuff, that is perfect, wonderful, informative information. Jeffrey's got a little bit of a different style. He's a little more grassroots, and there will be actionable items that folks can take from this presentation. So I just wanted to say that.
Oh, thank you for saying that, Lisa. Okay. Thank you. Appreciate that. All right, Jayne, we're ready for some questions.
I'm ready.
All right, so I have a question. Claudia just wanted to know quickly, will that Agile Service Management class be offered virtually?
Yes.
Perfect. So there you go, Claudia. And we have a question from Twitter. We've talked about Agile and Scrum, and what about Lean? Can you comment on that?
Yeah, no, I mentioned a little bit about Lean before because in truth you can't have Agile Service Management without some Lean elements. So, you know, first of all, the Agile Service Management course will have kind of a Lean component, but there also will be, and we'll be offering it Lean IT courses first quarter next year. So there's a line of training that will be coming out specifically about Lean, but you know, it's hard for us to talk about one without the other. So yes, there will absolutely be a Lean component. There has to be, because Lean is primarily about eliminating waste, and you can't have Agile Service Management while not being able to assess where your waste is and how to redirect the resources that are currently being used in waste to, you know, more productive work. So absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Rick has a comment. He said that we use the Agile concept of min viable process for service management. The rest of the team has taken a liking to this concept for service management.
Absolutely. I mean, minimal viable process, right? That's the just enough element. And that's why, you know, those two words have sort of resonated, right? We need just enough process in order to be able to accomplish what we need to accomplish in IT, regardless of which process that is. So minimum process, absolutely, I love it.
Mm-hmm. And then we have a question on, it sounds like Scrum will work well in a multi-team scenario. What if only one or two people are supposed to do requirements gathering, develop a product, and do communication, stakeholder management, complete all activities? How do you apply Scrum in that scenario, and what would be sprint 1 and 2 for such a scenario?
Okay, so I don't think I can get into as much detail as that question is asking, but I can take it a little bit higher level. So one of the core concepts in Scrum only actually has 3 roles. There's the role of a product owner. Now, we can translate that into Agile to be the process owner, right? But the product owner is the one that's gathering the requirements, that understands kind of the bigger scope of the work that needs to be done, and actually owns the backlog. So if I understand the question correctly, in this case there would be a product owner who then creates that backlog and then collaborates with the team in terms of what should go into each sprint. There's a sprint planning meeting that goes into each sprint from that product that makes sense in terms of how that product goes forward. And so there's 3 roles. There's a product owner, there's a Scrum Master who is more of a facilitator, makes sure the team is focused, removes impediments along the way or bottlenecks along the way, and then the 3rd role is just the team, right? So the Scrum Master and the product owner are part of the team, but if I'm understanding that question correctly, what you're really talking about are product owners, or in our world would be process owners.
And Jayne, I'm going to interject for just a second. As you know, I'm a proud member of a 2-person Scrum team for one of our projects. And 2 of the things that we learned, because you do have to serve in multiple roles, is be very realistic about what your deliverable products are going to be. we started off too highfalutin, and then once we started really chunking those down into things that we could get delivered in our 2-week sprints, it helped us immensely. And our second secret to success is do the debrief. The debrief is critically important, and when we first started, truthfully, sort of looked at all of Scrum and said, all right, there's only 2 of us, we've got to be lean about this, pun intended, and what parts of it do we have to do and what parts of it are realistic that just the 2 of us could do. And when we got to the point where we were breaking it down to small, realistic, deliverable products and consistent debriefs, we really were rocking and rolling. So just wanted to throw that in.
And that's great examples, because, I mean, what we all learned, and of course, you know, I've kind of been, you know, observing this, we learned a little bit about velocity, right? So we learned to understand what we could get done. And one of the big sprint concepts is the concept of a sprint retrospective, right? So after the sprint is over, is really being able to debrief and say, okay, how do we do on this sprint? In ITIL, we have post-implementation reviews, or, you know, we call them process review meetings. So again, very similar, but oftentimes, you know, we're so busy moving on to the next sprint that we don't take the time to do that retrospective or that debrief and move our way backwards. So thank you for that. Great example.
Yes, thank you, Lisa. And GoPro has a question that kind of parlays along with Lisa's comment. Can Agile be applied to all sizes of projects, small to large? And is there any case where Agile cannot be applied?
Well, I mean, you know, first of all, the answer is yes. Agile can be applied to any project. And as I said before, you know, the Scrum guide basically says a team should be more than 3 and less than 9. Okay, we stretch it with 2. So, again, very, very, you know, small projects. Now, it depends on your investment. So on a very small project, it would depend what the outcome of that project would be. If it's just a couple of sprints and it gets the project done, I see no reason not to do that, right? Again, you want to put just enough structure in place. So you don't want Scrum to be, you know, another bureaucratic approach to doing something. So you really have to kind of keep that just enough concept in mind. But I also think, Karen, what was the second part of the question? Help me.
And is there any case where Agile cannot be applied?
In concept, no, there's not a project where Agile could not be applied, because you can take each sprint as an increment of work and move it forward. There is in software development still a faction that very much looks at the waterfall approach, which is a step approach, right? So that, you know, it's you know, there's successors and predecessors, so the step above me and then the step below me, and we kind of work our way in more of a linear way forward. There are still some big traditional projects that are done using a waterfall approach. You know, I have mixed feelings about that just personally, because one of the challenges with taking a waterfall approach, whether it's to software development or any other project, is that your feedback loops occur at the end. So until you get to testing or until you get to that point, the ability to provide feedback sometimes is too late. So could you apply Scrum? And one of the big values of Scrum is the ability at the end of each sprint, as Lisa said, you know, to have that retrospective, to do that debrief, and so that you have a short feedback loop, so that when you move into the next one, if you need to make course corrections, if you need to look at opportunities to improve, you can, because it's only been 2 to 4 weeks, right? It hasn't been 2 to 4 months. So I personally believe you can apply Agile to every project, but I understand that in bigger, you know, projects, there is still a faction that believes that a waterfall approach still makes some sense.
Okay, thank you, Jayne. Denise just had a quick question about when is the next webinar date, so just in case she's going to be leaving us shortly, it is Thursday, August 21st, and that's Jeff Brooks with Gartner, and he's going to do a presentation titled Tell the Story with Business Value Dashboards, Denise. And Malaya is asking, could you bring up that slide, Jayne, that has the links on it?
Sure.
Thank you.
Here it is.
Perfect. Thank you. And Steve is saying we are just starting service management with ServiceNow, and this seems procedures, tools, etc. So how can we integrate Agile Service Management early in the process?
I'm sorry, Karen, could you repeat that, please? I didn't hear the whole thing.
Yes. So at Steve's organization, they're just starting service management with ServiceNow, and he's saying this seems to involve processes, procedures, tools, etc. So how can we integrate Agile Service Management early in this process?
Oh, I think they're at a great place for Agile Service Management because you're going to build your service management program forward, being Agile, as opposed to, trying to retrofit it in. And it's taking the same approach to any project, where you look at how you're developing your process and procedures, for example. And so, for example, let's say you were looking at change management. And your first activity in change management would be to submit a request for change. So you're designing the process, and your very first user story is submitting a request for change. So during that sprint, you look at all of the aspects of requesting a change. So your sprint is going to not focus on change management as a whole. Your sprint is going to focus on submitting a request for change. And so during that sprint, the members of the team will be tool people, will be process design, might have a user on the team, right, or a super user on the team. And so during that 2 or 4 week period of time, you're going to design the interface in ServiceNow for submitting a request for change. You're going to design the procedures for submitting a request for change, or you'll start with writing your user stories for a request for change. And at the end of that 2 weeks, all you've done is you've moved the project forward because you have now done everything associated with requesting a change. And then you move on to the next one, right? So you move your process forward. Instead of writing an end-to-end, all of the procedures associated with change management, you kind of build your way forward, an activity at a time, a piece of a process at a time. But during that sprint, you do everything associated with it, right? You design all the interfaces, all the integrations with other processes. You do all of that during that sprint, and then it's done, and then you move it forward. So you really take kind of an incremental approach for process design, and that's one of the things that we're going to teach in this Agile Service Management class. That's going to be kind of there's 2 parts to the class, but that's going to be a big piece of it, is how to design processes by applying some of the Scrum concepts.
Thank you for that question, Steve. Donna has a question. She's saying, in a typical Agile Service Management model, do break-fix issues with software generally get included in the model, or would this primarily be used for new projects, developments, enhancements?
I'm sorry, one more time for that one?
Okay. In a typical Agile Service Management model,
right,
do break-fix issues with software generally get included in the model, or would that primarily be used for new projects, new development, and new enhancements?
Oh, absolutely not. What you would want to do is you would want to look at your incident management process, of which break-fix would be a part of, right, probably as a standard change somewhere, and identify how to make that process more agile. So is it lean? Is there waste within that process? So it really then becomes, again, my hope with Agile Service Management is that as we move forward and you start to improve your processes, and part of that's going to be process design, right, where you're actually working within your processes, so there's a project element to that, that you look at your standard changes, or you look at your incident management process and say, okay, how do we eliminate some of the waste in recording this? But it becomes, you inject the word agile ultimately in front of all your processes. So hopefully someday you go from change management to agile change management. You go from incident management to agile incident management. So it becomes part of your continual improvement efforts as well as your process design efforts. So it's not just for new projects. You certainly can look at some of the procedures, the activities that you're currently doing in service management and identify whether they are agile or not, and if there are ways for you to make them more agile. And that's going to be a big part of DevOps, right? Because, not everything's going to be about a project. DevOps is about flow of work. And so in order for us to make service management more agile, we're going to have to look at how we improve, what improvement efforts we're taking now, because service management, we all know, is less about designing a process once, but about continually improving those processes. And if we have to get down to minimal process, right, to just enough, then I think at some point every process will get some type of analysis there. Great self-assessment opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Jacob has a question. For support teams focused on and comfortable with crunching tickets, are there ideas that could be incorporated from Agile in order to draw out proactive ideas?
Well, let me think on, well, again, as I said before, when you look at your support teams, I really think, and I've built this into the course, that we need to look at the key processes like incident management, problem management, change management, and looking at making them more agile. And so if we look at the velocity of the service desk in terms of their crunching tickets, the question then becomes, what is their velocity, right? What's their velocity today? What are their impediments in order to be able to improve their velocity but still maintain quality, right? We don't crunch tickets without quality, so how do we improve our velocity and still maintain the quality of support, and being able to apply some of the Agile and Scrum concepts to that. So I really believe that if we particularly take the three processes of change, incident, problem, maybe some configuration, and really look at how do we make those processes more agile, and we'll grow on that into other processes later. I think that would help the organization a lot because we'd improve velocity with quality. Or as Donna likes to say, get her done with quality.
Right. That's right. Velocity with quality, too.
Yes.
And then Holly's saying, perhaps that she missed this, but regarding organization of a project, how can one effectively organize project sprints so as to roll efforts to products without creating confusion, duplication, or unnecessary work? And then she added a comment, and she said, I find that the sprints are a bit disorganized on the project that I am participating on. Any advice?
Well, and again, self-organizing teams is, there's kind of a learned chemistry that comes from self-organizing teams, because sometimes self-organizing teams are not so organized, right? So, and that's part of the role of the Scrum Master. Scrum Master is not a project manager, is really not a technical expert, right? The Scrum Master is really just keeping the team focused, and if they're having a hard time organizing, figuring out what their impediments are that are stopping them from being organized. And of course, one of the big questions in Scrum becomes, where's the project manager in this? So this is not meant to replace project management. It's not meant to have redundant projects going on at the same time. It is a project management methodology that is very complementary to whatever project management technique you're using today, whether it comes from the PMBOK or Prince2 or whatever. So if I understand the question, I'm going to kind of turn it a little bit around. There still needs to be good project management, right? There still needs to be, good end-to-end project management. However you fit that into your project and getting your project done in increments that are done in sprints, the whole project still needs to be managed. So breaking your project down, so for example, a project manager defines all of the tasks that are associated with that project, right? At some point that becomes a backlog. So as opposed to looking at, who's assigned to what piece of it or whatever, it's really kind of serving not as the product owner or the process owner, still serving as the project manager to make sure that those sprints are somehow building forward towards a project, right? Because you could have sprints that are getting things done that are so not related to each other where, there's not some progression forward, but there's sort of, these random wild things that are getting done, and at some point would still be considered agile, but it's not making the project move any faster, and it's not moving the project towards completion. So I still think there needs to be a project manager that's going to manage the end-to-end project and hopefully keep those sprints from understanding that that piece that you just took from the backlog that the product owner says or the process owner says comes from the backlog makes the project still move forward. And so I would call it a little bit of the marriage, right, of project management and project execution together. Right? It's not a project management methodology. It's more of a project execution technique.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jayne.
I think the two go together well.
Yes. Yes, thank you. Rick has a question for you, and this is actually the last question that I have, so if anybody else has questions, now's the time to get them in. Rick wants to know, would you comment on the value of uncertainty when selecting Agile versus Waterfall? It seems that uncertainty is one of the largest drivers of Agile.
I'm not sure I understand the uncertainty aspect of the question. Again, I think one of the risks of Agile as opposed to Waterfall, because Waterfall is so structured in terms of, you know, each step in the waterfall, think about yourself stepping down a waterfall, has a very, very specific aspect of the project, particularly in software development. So it has a very, very specific goal. It's got a very specific name. So as you kind of walk down the waterfall, there's more structure that's associated with it. Again, the challenge with Waterfall, I think, and the reason that it's kind of being surpassed with Agile is that the feedback loops take a long time to get to, and the ability to walk back up the waterfall is difficult, right? So again, think about yourself coming down a waterfall. It's really easier to go down than it is to go back up. And so I think one of the risks of Waterfall has always been we get closer to the end and we find out, we either have a defect or the user story really wasn't correct, and to be able to retrofit, sometimes we push things into production because of that. In the Agile world, I think the biggest risk, and I'm not sure, I'm kind of getting the whole uncertainty thing, but is, as I said before, you can have these sprints that are, being done kind of in bubbles of sorts. And so, part of putting those bubbles together into a completed project does require some discipline. So just because we're operating in sprints doesn't necessarily mean the project is getting done. And so I think there's that risk of, okay, we're sprinting forward, but are we building on, is each sprint building us on what happened before or what's a necessary element, and is the project getting done? Whereas in Waterfall, you're pretty confident the project's getting done, even if it's not being done correctly. So, there's benefits and risks to both.
And a question from Joanna. She's asking, how do external IT auditors react to Agile? Does Agile and Scrum contain just enough documentation to definitely satisfy external IT auditors and definitely pass external IT audits? Great question.
Well, and it's a great question. And I will tell you very honestly, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know. I mean, from an auditing perspective, I don't know what, of course, we have to meet the documentation goals of our audits. I mean, that's just understood. So, in terms of how you're audited and what you're being audited to, whether it's regulatory compliance or Sarbanes-Oxley or whatever, certainly that has to be a guideline for what just enough means. Right? We certainly can't, minimize the amount of documentation or evidence that we provide to an auditor just because we're going Agile, right? It's like going green. So like, okay, it doesn't mean, we can eliminate paper, but it doesn't mean we eliminate documentation. So I think the first responsibility in any Agile environment is to understand from the beginning what the auditing requirements would be, as opposed to the other way around where an auditor comes into an Agile environment and says, hey, you're not doing enough. So I don't specifically know what auditors are looking for because I think that's very subjective in terms of what the auditing requirements are for the organization, but I certainly would say that the auditors are going to drive what just enough means. And again, your auditing experience, I think, will drive what just enough means. It's a great question, though.
And David made a comment. He said for audits you have to include compliance issues within each sprint. And that may make them just a bit longer to do that, but that's what his comment was for that.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, I said I honestly don't have a lot of knowledge or experience about the auditing aspects, but certainly something I want to learn more about. So again, great question.
Yes, I know. I'm not ready to go do research.
Yeah, right?